Requiem Metal Podcast, episode 15, Amorphis.
Welcome to Requiem Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Hundy.
And I'm Mark Rudolph, and joining us finally is the elusive Christopher L. Dick.
Hello.
Welcome, Chris. You've sort of become a rumor, a legend, a myth of sorts, and we've finally been able to hook up with you.
After a 9.5 hour drive?
Well, about 10 and a half hours because we got lost and drove through 7 very metal-like torrential rainstorms. So, but this is where we do all things metal here at the Requiem Metal Podcast, and hopefully some of you have been listening for a while now. And you know that we often make reference to Chris because he's sort of one of our fact checkers and kind of our giant sort of CPU of all things metal in a way. And so it's kind of cool to have you here. So obviously we're out in Philadelphia visiting. So appreciate you being here, Chris.
Thank you very much, guys.
So, tell us, maybe just give a little intro for your experiences, maybe in the metal world and where you're at, what you're doing out in Philly.
Street cred, or
right.
Give us the street cred.
Street cred. I can imagine my metal experiences probably don't differ too much from everyone else out there. You hear something heavy when you're a kid, like Metallica or Megadeth or Dokken or something like that.
Or Mordred even.
That came later, actually. Probably somewhere around the Metallica thing. You find yourself listening to something heavy, and you find something heavier, and it sounds cool, and you continue to sort of go through that heavy phase until you get the heaviest thing you could possibly imagine.
It's a lot of heaviness.
It's a lot of heaviness, a lot of steps. I think it goes from the thrash stuff like Testament and Metallica and Exodus to the sort of the borderline thrash stuff.
Slayer, Sepultura, Gateway kind of bands.
Right, I would say Slayer's a little more thrash in my opinion, because it doesn't really have the death element to it. But Sepultura definitely had that death element to it. So Sepultura was a huge gateway band, I think, for a lot of people. Sepultura led the, for me at least, into other things like Death and Morbid Angel. Trying to remember Bolt Thrower, maybe much later on. I think probably like a year or so later. But Sepultura definitely was sort of the gateway into heavier things. And of course, once you hear stuff like Death, you want to hear more stuff like Death. You want to hear stuff that's heavier and faster and harder. So,
well, you kind of make that decision of, is this too crazy? Do I kind of pull the reins in and never go forward, or you just dive in full blast?
I don't think I think I was unbridled, as it were.
Well, I think the three of us were. That's why we're sitting here doing this.
It was just like, God, I can't get enough.
So, I think, like I said, my experiences with metal probably don't differ from too many metal people out there, because we just continue to look for something heavier, faster, harder. And then eventually, once you find the heaviest, fastest, and hardest thing, you look for something that's actually better. Mm-hmm. Better musicianship, better production. You look for those things because, you have your own aesthetic.
Sure.
And each person's a little different, so you kind of gravitate to one side or another, whether you like the grindcore thing, which is dirty and punky, or you like the more atmospheric thing, like death metal, like we're going to talk about today, which is Amorphis. Mm-hmm. So eventually you kind of, find your niche, and then you continue to explore down, you drill down into those subgenre of subgenres. So
absolutely, and I should say, from a personal level, obviously we've talked a lot. We've almost given a backstory to you in several episodes, just because of your experiences.
I'm also a listener, actually.
Yeah. Well, that's good. That's good. One of our 4 out there. I'm just kidding. But your experiences working on the magazine early on with Mark, and then of course you and I worked together, or the 3 of us worked together on Eclipse, and then you were actually one of my gateways sort of into the European scene, because my group of friends were about 4 grades behind you guys, and you were working at the record store and kind of the peddler of death metal,
right?
European death metal specifically.
I focused on it. It's just
exactly. So, and it's interesting because one of the bands that drew me in to the record store when I was a sophomore in high school to explore more of this European stuff was the band Amorphis, which we're going to be talking about today. And Amorphis is, of course, one of the heavyweights of Finland and the Finnish metal scene. And if you've been listening, our last episode was also dealing in Finland with Tuonela, who sang and participated with Impaled Nazarene and Black League and Sentence. And
should mention, if anyone was confused by song order.
If you were confused a little bit by the song order of that episode, we should put a sort of editor's note disclaimer, correction in the letters column, if you will, that during one of the sets of music, I can't remember which one, if it was the end of the first set, we played New Age Messiah, yet we hadn't planned to play it because we actually talked about it in the next set. And we're supposed to open the second set with it, and we actually opened with White Wedding, the Billy Idol cover. So if you were a little bit confused or scratching your head as to what you were hearing, that was obviously...
That was called tired producer syndrome.
Yeah. It happens.
Producer
but anyway,
error.
Yeah, producer error. Back to Amorphis, you guys obviously, were into Amorphis way sooner than I was, so maybe give a little bit of a background on who Amorphis were and kind of a little glazed overview, if you will.
Sure. My first experience with Amorphis was really in that search for something harder, faster, better, more atmospheric. I think at that point I was pretty experienced with Paradise Lost, the Gothic album, so I kind of knew that I really liked the sort of the melancholic, melodic side of death metal. And when you start looking for things like that, there's a lot of references and people draw parallels to certain bands, and you just kind of continue to drill down. I'd heard of Amorphis through fanzines and newsletters and flyers and stuff prior to, buying the first album, actually, the Karelian Isthmus. So, went to a record store, found it on CD, and, I think I looked actually at the cover, which was this amazing battle scene, very artistically done. And then I looked at the spine or the inside tray card. It said "Purveyors of Fine Grind," which I thought was actually kind of funny. But but I was just really intrigued by the logo, the cover, because the cover was so different from a lot of other death metal releases out there. It actually had it was brutal, metallic, but it was a battle scene, tastefully done by an artist called Moran Kim. But I just picked it up.
Is that a Wide Earp purchase?
It was a Wide Earp purchase, yeah. Wide Earp was a record store in Flint that I used to frequent on weekends and so forth.
And if you've been listening, it had some connections with Repulsion.
Sure.
Yeah, we have a lot of anecdotes about.
Yeah. Flint has a connection to Repulsion, so all things Flint, all things Repulsion invariably kind of dovetail back to Wide Earp. But anyway, so I bought the record at Wide Earp in high school. Took it home, listened to it, and was immediately floored by it just because it sounded so different from even the stuff that we were listening to at the time, like Entombed, Dismember, Unleashed, and Grave. It had a whole different element to it. It was kind of like those bands combined with Paradise Lost.
So kind of the melancholy kind of melodicism.
Absolutely. They had a melodic trait that I don't think a lot of the Swedish bands had at that point.
They had a real warmth to their sound.
There was a warmth to it. The vocals were insanely deep, which for some reason attracted me to no end. The deeper the better, I guess. Even though Tommy, the vocalist at the time, mispronounced words and stuff like that, it was still very charming and very, alluring. You couldn't get enough of it. So I think what typically happened was I took the record home, listened to it, was floored by it, and then went over to Mark's house and we sat there and listened to it, and we're both floored by it, and he went out and bought it, and next thing you know, I think we were writing letters to the label at the time, which was Relapse, saying how great the album was, and I think that sort of began the relationship between our magazine at the time, Requiem, and the Relapse label. And Amorphis too, because we actually interviewed Amorphis in our first issue in '93. So, that's kind of started our love affair with Amorphis.
A lot of memories kind of attached to that.
Absolutely, I think there's a lot of history, and I'm trying to recall it all as we as I go here. But there's a lot of things that happened with Amorphis that sort of triggered a lot of other events. I think it was tied to the formation of our fanzine. It was tied to our communication with probably Relapse at the time. Mark and myself, figuring out how we wanted to do a magazine, how we could do it, just kind of going at it. We didn't really think about it too much. We just kind of did it. We just started it and went with it, and that was it. But Amorphis was definitely a nice trigger for that. Start, if you want to call it.
And it's interesting that you kind of refer to it as a trigger because for sort of my metal friend who's done a couple podcasts with us, Grindcore Coon, or Jeff, if you will, whichever he prefers.
Boring,
yeah, Jeff. When you got a Grindcore Coon as your surname, you can
you can do anything.
You can do anything. And he and I were in high school, and we came across in a bargain bin at the used record store, which Chris worked at the time, called New Moon Records, and then eventually Mark and I worked there a few years later. And it was a 10 Years of Nuclear Blast compilation, and that was at the time when Relapse had been combined with Nuclear Blast. I'm not completely sure on all the details of that relationship.
They basically just kind of licensed. They're the U.S. branch of Nuclear Blast.
Yeah, it was a licensed deal. Nuclear Blast was looking for a stateside presence in the States, and Relapse happened to be the right label at the time to do that. So Relapse put a lot of resources into building that label in the U.S. I don't think Nuclear Blast, as it exists today, as Nuclear Blast America, would be Nuclear Blast America if it didn't have the Relapse Foundation.
Yeah, sure.
The staff at Relapse did a pretty big job of building the label, building the artist, building the brand. All those things kind of,
Oh, absolutely.
Help that label.
And what was neat about it is it was a mixture of Nuclear Blast bands and Relapse bands that were on this, 10 years compilation. And there was a song on it from Amorphis, and this is at a time when, my friends and I had heard Morbid Angel and Obituary and Sepultura and some of these sort of American versions. We had not heard anything except maybe, I don't know if we had gotten a hold of Wolverine Blues at that time, but Wolverine Blues even for where Entomb was in terms of their sound at that point wasn't, they weren't going to provide us a gateway into what true Swedish or European death metal sounded like. It was more death and roll at the time. But on the CD, it had a song on it that was called Karelia, and it was from Amorphis. And whereas Jeff really linked on to, I think, the Gorefest song, it was a live version of Mental Misery, and then the Pungent Stench song, and maybe a couple other things, I really got hooked on this tune, Karelia, which is funny because it's actually not Karelia. It was mislabeled Karelia, and it was actually the song called The Gathering, which is the first kind of regular full-length song on the Karelian Isthmus. But it prompted me to mail order. I don't know how I did it. I think through Relapse, possibly from an Eclipse or a Requiem magazine that you guys had the Relapse order form things on there, and I ordered Tales from a Thousand Lakes from Amorphis. Which is funny because it's not even the record that the song that I liked was off of, but it was the one that was big and bold in the ad, and it was being recommended as some great masterpiece of death metal. So I said, yeah, sure, I'll try it, and I was hooked immediately for the same reason, sort of this European mysticism. It was very different than any of the other death metal that I had been listening to, and what was cool about it is it prompted me to kind of come into the record store and start ordering some European metal CDs. And Chris happened to be working at that time, and that really was the sort of trigger and the floodgate for me and my friends, to start getting into a lot of this stuff. And that's where, I ordered Tiamat from you, I remember, and that's when you immediately gave me that Relapse compilation. I had Meshuggah and Dissection, and it was, again, a Nuclear Blast Relapse kind of, deal going on there, and Dismember, and, the rest is history, as they say, so... But Amorphis as a band were quite young when they started off. That's one of the kind of things that was sort of always attached to them. I just remember people always talking about their age, like these guys are still in high school or just graduating high school and putting this sort of stuff out.
Yeah, they were in their late teens, I think.
Yeah.
And we'll correct you actually real quick, Jason. It wasn't 10 years, it was 5 years Nuclear Blast.
Oh, was it the 5 years of Nuclear Blast? Oh, okay.
That would change your credibility factor.
Yeah, that's true. So it feels like Nuclear Blast had been around that long at the time.
I think it's almost 25 years.
Yeah, that makes me feel old. But anyways, thanks for that. But the first thing that Amorphis recorded was the Privilege of Evil EP, right?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, and that was recorded in 91. I don't know when it was finally put out. I think it was put out after Karelian Isthmus, wasn't it?
Well, actually, it was put out just after Karelian Isthmus in response to Karelian Isthmus.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
That was kind of the thing that sold Relapse on signing them, then?
I think so. Well, they had the Disment of Soul demo, and then I think Relapse put out the single with Vulgar, Necrolatry, and Misery Path.
Which we're going to play.
Which I think it was available on a 7-inch, and I think both Mark and I had that 7-inch.
I still do.
sold mine a long time ago, sadly. But I think that was sort of the beginning of the Relapse Amorphis relationship. And at that time, it was recorded in '91, released in actually almost a year later, strangely enough. But that was sort of the beginning of the Relapse Amorphis relationship. And then from the 7-inch came the full length, and then shortly after the full length, they actually released the Privilege of Evil EP, which I think was a Discman of Soul demo and the single.
Gotcha. That's why we got our fact checker here. And before I butcher these guys' names, Chris has better pronunciation and diction than I think than I do. I'm going to let Chris sort of lay out the original lineup names for you because they can be a little bit difficult.
Sure. I think if I'm, again, I'm just as bad as Jason on these names, but Tomi Kuvasari, he was the guitar player and he was the frontman after the Abhorrence vocalist left or didn't appear. He never appeared on the full length, but he did one guest vocal on Vulgar Necrolatry. Mm-hmm. There Asa Holopainen, who was the lead guitar player, Jan Reschberger, who was the drummer.
Keyboards on Karelian as well.
Keyboards on Karelian. Did he do keyboards on Karelian?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to remember who the other...
Oli-Pekka
Lane, Opu, as they call him, was on bass.
Yeah.
So that was
the original lineup.
That was the original Amorphis lineup. And I think if you look on the inside of the cover, you'll see photos of them. They're standing around in like a pool of
a stream
water,
or something.
Stream
yeah.
a
fjord.
A fjord.
They look like we did more or less in our senior year of high school. Long sleeve shirts and jeans and looking pensive.
Nervous as a bunch of 17-year-olds being photographed.
Exactly right. Not sure how to pose and trying to figure out how to project a personality.
These kind of look like our the first Requiem press photos kind of thing that we put in the editor's columns.
Yeah,
right.
I remember those.
Hugging trees.
Yeah, in the graveyards and stuff, yeah.
Exactly. So, that was all part of the death metal sort of...
Aesthetic
at the time was to look like that. But, yeah.
Yeah, and, so we're gonna listen to some music from one song from The Privilege of Evil, which is which tune, Chris?
Vulgar Necrolatry, which is originally on that single. So one of the oldest songs that Amorphis did, correct? Right.
Probably.
Yeah. It was actually, I think it's actually an old Abhorrence song, which was another death metal band from Finland that sort of stemmed. That's where Tomi came from. He came from Abhorrence, and they actually formed in '89.
Was Asa involved with them at all?
Asa was not involved with it. It was just Tomi. And they put out a demo and an EP, and that EP, I think it was released on Seraphic Decay, which is, one of those labels. At this point, anything on Seraphic Decay you want to find because it's going to,
be worth a ton.
It'll be worth a ton, and and not on eBay. But it also had a lot of good stuff. At the time, it was kind of everything kind of sounded the same. But I think when you go back and listen to a lot of that stuff, it was actually pretty unique in hindsight.
Yeah. Well, like that paroxysm,
sure, the paroxysm
CD is really solid, and Finnish stuff always had that, really it sounds like they had an injection of 70s with death metal, like Swedish death metal and 70s music kind of wrapped into one. This weird warmth,
sure,
and major chord scales kind of stuff, and
absolutely. Whereas I hear so much of the Thomas Skogsberg did the production for Karelian Isthmus, which of course he's famous for the Stockholm sound,
right?
And so you hear a lot of that in there. But as Mark was saying, also this different kind of almost analog 70s warmth is sort of going on. And obviously we'll talk in the next set a lot more about the rise of the kind of keyboard and progressive rock music in the path that Amorphis is going to take. Any other major differences in sound between, say, Privilege of Evil and when finally, Karelian Isthmus comes out, other influences of sound that came in? Because we're going to play the song from Privilege of Evil and then a trio of songs from Karelian Isthmus, which I'll mention in just a second. But
in my opinion, I think the main difference is I think Amorphis was discovering their melodic self. I think they were learning how not to just play a death metal sort of / grindcore punk thing going on. I think they really started to figure out how to incorporate melody and lead guitar,
Eastern sounds and stuff,
Middle Eastern sounds, scales, different things like that. I think they're really, starting to sort of branch out and try and differentiate themselves from other bands from Finland and from Sweden and from the rest of the world. So I think ideally, it's the main difference. I think is the melodic sense, and of course the production definitely helps when you have Thomas Skogsberg helming the boards, so to speak. But I think the main thing is Amorphis' songwriting skills are getting better. They're getting a little more melodic. They're learning how to integrate the melody into the heavy stuff. Making, if something's heavy all the time and heavy and fast all the time, it's cool for a short period of time, and then it sort of becomes ineffective. And I think if they learn how to add dynamic to that heavy sound, it kind of makes those heavier things seem even heavier. So I think that's the main difference.
So with that, we're going to hear, as Chris said, the song from Privilege of Evil, Vulgar.
Necrolatry.
Yeah, I love not saying that word because I look at
Necrolatry.
it. And then we're going to hear a trio from Karelian Isthmus, the song that kind of hooked me, hook, line, and sinker, The Gathering, and then Exile of the Sons of...
I think it's pronounced Uisliu. Uisliu. It's Irish. So
some Irish legend, right?
It's based on an Irish myth, Usnech, or something like that. But again, we're probably pronouncing it wrong, and someone from Ireland can happily email Mark or Jace and let them know how we butchered that name. But it's a great song.
Yeah, and then one of Mark's personal favorites, The Sign from the North Side, because it's a song that actually you can...
back in, when was this? Probably mid to late 90s. I could play this on drums with... spoons. I'm sure I played the double bass with a single bass pedal. It sounded horrible, but since we could kind of play it, it seemed pretty neat.
Yeah.
I'm sure the original drummer, Jan Reckberger, who's actually an Amorphis now, would find that kind of funny.
So enjoy our opening set of Amorphis.
Life I see, life
Welcome back to the Requiem Metal Podcast. We're listening to Amorphis, and you just heard 3 songs from the Karelian Isthmus. You heard The Sign from the North Side, the last song before that, and then Exile of the Sons of
Uisliu?
Yeah, it sounds like something from Tolkien or something, which would make sense. It's an Irish, myth. Then The Gathering, and then you heard an older song from The Privilege of Evil, kind of first album demo days, Vulgar, Necrolatry. Yeah.
Just think of idolatry.
Idolatry.
Necrolatry to it.
Well, and obviously, I think of death and idolatry in the same
there you go.
Sentence.
So that should help you. Every time you look at that word now, you'll think of idolatry, necrolatry.
Yeah. And joining us again is Chris, which you probably already know because you've been listening.
You've been listening to this podcast for 28 minutes.
We're going to be kind of talking about the next major era, which this was, to me, the breakout point for Amorphis, which was Tales from a Thousand Lakes. And like I mentioned in the previous Talkset, the first record I got a hold of in complete form. Here they've added a full-time keyboard player, Casper Martinson, right?
Yep.
And he actually started contributing some songwriting. He actually wrote the kind of major song on this record, which kind of surprised me. I didn't think I had connected that he wrote Black Winter Day, the music at least. And this is introducing all kinds of new elements to Amorphis that some people found appealing and some people really didn't like. They're kind of really testing the waters with some clean vocals, with a lot of really progressive 70s keyboards and Moogs and things like that. For you guys who had heard the previous album, going into this transition probably was very different for you. Whereas for me, it was like the only thing I knew, so it made sense to me because it was, all that I knew was this album, if that makes sense. What was your guys' reaction to some of these new elements?
My reaction was, I think Mark and I, since we had established a relationship with Relapse, we had sort of starting to receive promotional product from the label, and I remember receiving a compilation. I don't even remember if it was officially released or if it was just like a radio or press compilation. Mm-hmm. And it had a song called "Drowned Maid" on it, and that was the first thing we'd heard from this Tales from the Thousand Lakes album. And immediately we were hooked. It was like
heavy rotation.
it was that track, and I think exclusively on that compilation was probably the only thing we listened to, just because A, the track was strong, and B, everything else, I don't know, probably
surrounded by Mortician tracks.
Exactly, everything else is a little, let's say, maybe forgettable, at least in comparison to Drowned Maid. Drowned Maid was a furthering of Amorphis' melodic sensibilities, and I think that it's primarily Paradise Lost. I think when Mark and I first heard that, the first thing we thought of was Gregor Mackintosh.
Yeah.
It's faster than any of those old Paradise Lost songs, but I think the sensibility is there. It has a really super catchy lead riff, if you want to call it that, lick, and then it has a sort of pretty medium to fast tempo double bass thing going on there, and I think at the same time you have Tommy kind of coming in with this really ultra deep, but at the same time atmospheric vocals, and kind of the track just kind of sails.
Mm-hmm. I think the production kind of stepped up
absolutely
a couple steps too. Everything's a little bit more clear and crisper and tighter.
Right.
It's funny too that you say Paradise Lost, because it's almost as if Amorphis had become the band if Paradise Lost had pursued what they started with Lost Paradise, instead of really slowing down and getting ultra gothic-y. That's almost what Amorphis was starting to sound like, in a way. You know what I mean? Like, had they not kind of gotten really the direction Paradise Lost took was different, but if they had sort of stayed with what they tried on Lost Paradise, it almost would have maybe become what Amorphis started to sound like. I don't know if that makes any sense whatsoever to you guys.
Amorphis had a little more folkish elements incorporated to kind of differentiate them. But
I would agree with that. I think you definitely heard that on this record. You heard a couple of things happening actually on this record. I think you heard Amorphis becoming less death metal and more melodic, and you heard Amorphis sort of experimenting with different textures, keyboard textures primarily, different tones, colors, textures. I think everything. I don't know if I said that already, but I think that what you heard with Amorphis was you heard them sort of extending their arms a little bit to figure out what they were capable of. And in the years that separated Karelian Isthmus from Tales from a Thousand Lakes, I think it's almost like a quantum leap in musicianship, in songwriting. I think this is Amorphis' breakout record. I think this is, to this day, in fact, Amorphis' number one selling album.
For a while, wasn't it the number one selling record that Relapse had?
Yes, it was. I think. Yeah. I think that was finally eclipsed by
Dillinger.
By Dillinger. Yeah, Dillinger Escape Plan. But I mean, this was the band that kind of launched not only Relapse, because they realized that, hey, this stuff actually sells and people are actually interested in this stuff, primarily in Germany, but it also launched 1,000 other bands that sounded like it. Or
I was going to say, this was
it was
the birth of the melodic death metal movement, almost.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is sort of the one of the beginning points of melodic death metal.
Because for as great as Skydancer from Dark Tranquillity and Lunar Strain and stuff, they didn't have the exposure. I mean, this was a big record. It was very well promoted.
Yeah,
it was in everyone's face in the underground,
Right.
Whereas like Skydancer sort of was under the radar, and Lunar Strain was sort of quiet,
right,
in their impacts. And
I think one of the key things to remember about this record, and I remember when I think Mark and I were listening to it either in his room or in my room or in our car. It was probably on a cassette tape, I'm sure.
Yeah.
In probably Mark's car, because he probably had a car before I did. Was two things. Two things. Let's say this: keyboards for one, and clean vocals. So you had this two very different things coming into Amorphis' sound, even if they're more melodic, like on Drowned Maid. They had some stuff that really kind of blew people away. Like, what is this? Like, who is this guy singing? He kind of had sort of inflections of Axl Rose in some way, shape, or form. Yeah. But then you had a keyboard player with Casper, writing these like for Black Winter Day and Magic and Mayhem, two very different keyboard styles, in fact. But you had these huge swaths of melodic keyboards coming across with the riffs. And I think that really was the first thing that set Amorphis apart from everyone. And I think everyone bought that. Everyone bought that idea because, at the time it was nothing like it. And nothing sounded like Amorphis.
They carried kind of the keyboards into a lead instrument capacity instead of just like this background pumping up the wall of sound kind of thing.
Right.
And that was the progressive music elements that Asa, correct, was really bringing a lot.
I would say it's probably Asa. It was probably the collective. I don't really know much about Casper's musical history prior to Amorphis or his musical history after Amorphis, but I think where it differed from other keyboard death metal bands at the time that used it for intros and stuff was the single fact that they didn't use it. They used it as a lead instrument, but they didn't use it as a lead instrument. They didn't use it like the Malmsteen Jens Johansson collaboration. It wasn't a lead guitar soloing and then a keyboard soloing.
Yeah, it wasn't like Children of Bodom is today or something.
Exactly. It was more of a textural element, and then occasionally it was allowed to sort of pop out and color the song. And I think that was the main difference. And I think people really thought that was amazing. And again, I think this record is kind of very similar to the way Paradise Lost Gothic is. It's sort of one of those things you've never heard before. And I think that's why it remains compelling today.
Absolutely. And, the trio of songs that we're going to hear from this record, we're going to start with probably their most famous song, Black Winter Day.
Absolutely.
Absolutely completely blazing. And we're going to go from that into First Doom and then Drowned Maid, the track that Chris and Mark were talking about that they heard early on prior to the record actually coming out. And again, one thing we should mention is that this was the first time that Amorphis took their lyrics not from sort of kind of death metal standards, but they took them from an actual Finnish sort of folk book. It wasn't the Kalevala.
Kalevala or Kantele, I can't remember.
No, it was the Kalevala.
Kalevala?
Yeah, and that was interesting from a folk element that they were drawing from a totally new source, which for death metal, you didn't, take lyrics from, sort of folk legends. That was totally unique, and then they'll kind of continue that path with the next record, Elegy. So it will be a giant leap if you've never heard Amorphis and you just obviously heard the previous set of music. This is sort of a giant leap forward, as Chris said, but everyone seemed to kind of hook in and myself included, and I became instantly addicted to melodic death metal, and that's, the rest is history, as they say. So we're going to start with a trio of songs, like I said, Black Winter Day, First Doom, and Drown Maid, and then we're going to round things out with a song called Moon and Sun from the Black Winter Day EP, which we can talk a little bit about when we come back. So enjoy.
Sword
Welcome back to the Requiem Metal Podcast. We're listening to Amorphis, as I'm sure you're aware of. We just heard Moon and Sun from the Black Winter Day EP, which was released right after Tales from a Thousand Lake, and then a trio of songs from Tales from a Thousand Lake. We heard Drowned Maid, First Doom, and Black Winter Day. And of course, now that Amorphis has gained a huge sense of popularity after Tales from a Thousand Days, sorry, I'm getting Black Winter Day EP and Tales from a Thousand Lakes confused. But yeah, as they're starting to open up this new sort of melodic death metal sound, they kind of became the flagship band of Relapse for quite a while, at least until probably after Elegy. And so Relapse really concentrated on really pumping up Amorphis for this next record. And this is when, Mark, you were working at Relapse when Elegy, the next
some
record.
design work on some of the posters, a little bit of the interior work, and I think most of the advertising campaign for the record.
Yeah. And this is
the bumper stickers.
Oh yeah,
don't forget the bumper stickers.
I still have some of those. Actually.
Yeah, do you really?
Yeah,
I'd like one if you can find one, because I had one on my old truck, and I got rid of the old Ford Ranger, and it was full of all those wonderful bumper stickers I couldn't peel off. And this is a very marked difference. It follows sort of the trajectory that Tales from Thousand Lakes was taking, but Amorphis has changed their logo. Everything about this record nothing says death metal anymore to me.
The first time I looked at that cover, I was like, looks like Ozric Tentacles.
Yeah, it looks like a progressive rock CD or something.
Yeah, you're right.
It's the feel that they're sort of going for, is this sort of mystical analog 70s kind of folk element mixed with progressive rock.
Right.
I would say, which is near and dear to Chris, and in some ways myself and Mark, because we were kind of coming out of that element because of the record store we worked at. We were exposed to a lot of that kind of stuff, And what would you say? I mean, first of all, I think the keyboards, they get a new keyboard player.
Yeah. Ken Rontala.
Yeah. What would you say would be the marked difference between him and Casper? I mean,
more of a lead player, and I think Amorphis allowed Kim to be more of a lead player. And I think on this record, if I remember correctly, the first thing that he was compared to was John Lord from Deep Purple. Because he was playing, the Hammond B organ, and I think if I'm not mistaken,
I think you're
he was
right.
playing keyboards. But I think they allowed him to kind of come into the forefront, and instead of being a textural and forefront guy, he was simply just a forefront guy. But Amorphis played off that like Deep Purple. They didn't really use him as a flashy soloist. They used him more of as here's a guy playing an instrument like a guitar, but it just happened to be ebony and ivory, And there was never really a sense of competition between the guitar and the keyboard. It was all integrated, much like you alluded to before, like a progressive rock band. When they do things right. When they're not, battling egos and who can play the fastest arpeggios. So I think that's a big difference here, and also obviously
the new vocalist.
I mean, I think at that point Tommy was. I think he just didn't want to sing anymore. He was tired of doing death metal vocals. I think he got bored with it. Unfortunately for Mark and I, and probably Jason, that we really like his vocals. But, I think he did some vocals on this record, but I think, then he also did some tambourine work, which is kind of interesting. But he just wanted to be, I think he wanted to be done with it. So they hired a new vocalist, Pasi Koskinen, and I think he's split the album 50-50, clean, death. It's kind of one of those records where some songs are more clean than death, some songs have a little bit more death than clean, other songs are more evenly split down the middle. And that was really an extension of the clean vocal experimentation on Tales from Thousand Lakes, brought to a whole new level.
Mm-hmm. And they used, like we mentioned before, they used the Kantele. Is that how you pronounce
Kantele.
it? Kantele. Another Finnish sort of poem ballad book full of legends and myths and things like that.
I think it says it's 700 poems and ballads based on ancient Finnish traditions.
And they're getting, they're throwing in some new instruments. The electric sitar, you're going to hear some of that. A lot more Middle Eastern type influences are here.
Yep.
Thomas Skogsberg's still doing the production, but I feel like he's really sort of, they're splitting it between that and some Finnish producers in Helsinki and some other places. But it definitely has a totally new feel, and in many ways they're about to start to walk out of the the extreme metal genre and totally into a new genre, which Amorphis sort of starts to embrace after this period.
Atmospheric progressive metal.
Yeah, there you go. That's a good name. But this thing was everywhere. This thing was everywhere. I remember, playing this for lots and lots of people. This was very much a gateway CD for a lot of my younger friends. I would throw this CD at them, and they're like, "Oh, it's death metal," but it's not. Kind of like Opeth and some of these other things.
It was a gateway. It was definitely a gateway CD.
And they also followed it up with an EP, which we'll talk about later. But we're going to hear a trio of songs from Elegy, this record we're talking about. And Elegy came out in '96, in case we didn't mention it before. And the trio of songs we're going to hear are Better Unborn, My Kantele, the original version, which Amorphis will do an acoustic version of that ends the album, but we won't play that, and then Weeper on the Shore. So enjoy a trio of Amorphis. welcome back to the Requiem Metal Podcast. You just heard a trio of songs from Amorphis' Elegy, Weeper on the Shore, Kantele? Yeah, sorry. That was my pass off to Chris because he's the pronunciation expert here. And then Better Unborn. After Elegy, they followed it up with another EP, just like they had done on the prior record, Tales from a Thousand Lakes. And this is an EP named after
My Kantele. It's after the Kantele. Kanteletar.
Yeah.
Called My Kantele.
And this was a pretty cool EP. It featured a couple of cover songs from Hawkwind. Was that the era with Lemmy or after Lemmy? Levitation. Yeah.
I don't know actually. In fact, I don't know Hawkwind well enough to know if Levitation was with Lemmy or not.
No idea. And then Kingston Wall. And Kingston Wall, I don't know much about, but Chris, you know a teeny bit about.
Sure. Kingston Wall was probably one of the primary influences on Amorphis as they sort of exited the death metal era, their death metal era. I think Kingston Wall was a Finnish progressive rock band, beloved in Finland, and I think that's probably why Amorphis was, one, influenced by Kingston Wall, and two, decided to cover And I Hear You Call. So I think, even though they're covering, I think it actually has a much deeper meaning. I think that they're heavily influenced by that and wanted to sort of slide into that sound. They wanted to slide into something heavy, but more proggy, atmospheric, wayward. Yeah, and
you hear that on the centerpiece tunes, the two original songs of this record, the Brother Slayer, and then the second part of the Brother Slayer called The Lost Son, which we're going to be playing the first part, the Brother Slayer, in the next kind of closing set. And the EP was put out a year after Elegy in 1997. And then Amorphis was sort of quiet for a year and a half or so, and then sort of graced us with what, all three of us sort of disagree or kind of agree or whatever. It kind of closes out the first sort of classic era of Amorphis before they really... how would you describe the period after... You said they got kind of lazy a little bit, or just kind of kept repeating themselves. And
to me, it sounded like Amorphis didn't quite know what they were doing. And it sounded like they were trying to figure out how to take... the magic, if you want to call it that, of the Brother Slayer and its companion piece, the instrumental, into a song-based format where you could actually hear choruses and verses and stuff like that more in a traditional setting. And I think what happened was they kind of they became complacent, in my view, and I think that there's a little bit of a spark that was lost, probably to do with touring, finances, resources, all those things that sort of influence the way you create things. I mean,
wasn't there kind of an issue with Posse at that point too, with not wanting to perform? And
I believe Posse had sort of become a little too comfortable in his role as the vocalist, and probably wasn't as agreeable, and probably didn't give 100%. Or 110% rather, like he did in Elegy. I think, Elegy, he was like, I have something to prove. Tuonela, the follow-up album, and we'll talk about that shortly. I think he was like, I'm the vocalist, big deal. Yeah. That's just my viewpoint on that.
Yeah. And to me, on Tuonela, they're completely done with death metal. I mean, you hear it in one song, Greed, I think, and you hear a little bit in the song that we'll hear Divinity. Tommy's, I think, doing some raspy, maybe backing vocals, or maybe it's just double track Posse or whatever. Mm-hmm. But to me, it's the best thing that they did of this style. And then, like Chris said, they sort of kind of fell apart and got boring. And really, I don't pay much attention to the albums after this, except for...
Well, the last two are really solid, I think.
Yeah, the last two. And they have a new vocalist now. Posse left, correct?
Yeah, Posse left after Am Universum. And they got a new...
No, not after Am Universum.
Oh, after Far From the Sun, sorry. Far From the Sun. He left after... That was the last Relapse record, Am Universum. But he left after the first Nuclear Blast record, Far From the Sun.
Yeah. And what's the newer record? Silent Waters and Eclipse? No.
Yeah, those. Yep. Yeah. It was Eclipse, then Silent Waters. Silent Waters released last year.
Yeah, and those are both really solid records. But given the time constraints, we're sort of stopping here at the final destination, which is Tuonela.
Yep.
And thoughts on this record? I know you and I are big fans, and Mark, you sort of were kind of out at this point.
I think I went back and got it to be a completist, but yeah, when it came out, I think I was kind of out of. I was kind of done with Amorphis.
Sure, and a lot of people I think were, because I mean they really were done being a death metal band at this point. There were no traces.
Right. I think what they did something too fast. I think they exited the things that made people like them in the first place, which is the death metal thing first, and then the atmospheric, the melodic death metal thing second. And I think then they added the folk element thing a lot on Elegy. So those three things they kind of, diluted, if you want to call it that, on Tuonela. And I think when people heard that, it was really hard for them to grasp the change. And I think they pulled away from that far too fast. They should have put Tuonela out. I'm thinking, 3 albums from Elegy. That would have been, if there would have been a lot more albums in between there, I think people would have adjusted to change a lot better. And I think Amorphis probably would have written better songs as a result of having a lot longer time to sort of stretch and grow out of its sort of melodic death metal roots.
Sure, and I think this is a really hit or miss record. I think there's some really fantastic songs on it, and some really kind of cringeworthy songs in some ways.
And it's Posse. I mean, I think Posse is the music is a little slow, a little meandering, a little sort of daydreamy, which is nice because it kind of has like a Pink Floyd kind of vibe to it. But I think Posse, his voice and his conviction, his delivery, I think bordered on lazy in parts. And I can only imagine what the studio was like with producer Simon Efemi, who did Paradise Lost.
Yeah, and you've got. Now, in the last record we added the sitar and the accordion and some of these things, and now we're adding, saxophones and flutes and things like this.
Which I think are all cool things to add to the Amorphis texture.
But it's, like you said, it's maybe a kitchen sink approach. It's just maybe too much for some of the fans to have absorbed and adjust it to, And I followed along with it, but that's also, I had a lot more roots, as you did, in listening to a lot more sort of progressive rock and things like that, so I could kind of find something to grab a hold of that made sense to me.
Right, you're open to it.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't need every band I listened to kind of be a melodic death metal band at that point, but...
Yeah, you did.
Well, yeah. I tried.
No, I think they did, a lot of other bands did this style better, and I was just like, well, Amorphis, this was just kind of, too much too soon.
Yep.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like a lot of bands will do like a fantastic like death metal record, then second record, hey, let's just do clean vocals, and they're not up to the task.
Like The Gathering,
or like the Abyssos.
Yeah.
Second record is like, oh, come
Rapture
on.
kind of was. There were a couple uncomfortable songs in that second Rapture song.
But then Kantele did it, but played to their strengths. They didn't try to sing falsetto vocals or something. But that's kind of what kind of turned me off to this record.
And for me, when I put this record on, I don't listen to it straight through. I pick out a few songs that I like, such as the one we're going to play, Divinity. I think it's one of Posse's stronger performances, especially during the chorus.
That's probably why it's the single.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's what we're going to kind of close things out with today is Brother Slayer from the My Kantele EP, and then Divinity from the Tuonela album, kind of ending the 90s for Amorphis. This is put out in 99 and kind of the end of their golden era, if you will. But any final closing thoughts on Amorphis?
Sure. I think that we're sort of remiss in not including Greed just because it has the death metal vocals, but at the same time I think we're also remiss in not being able to include Nightfall. I felt Nightfall was a really strong track. I think Mark said it had like a Calypso vibe to it, but it also
we had to cut it for time reasons.
Yeah, but it has a saxophone. And traditionally, I hate saxophone in heavy metal music. I think it doesn't belong. I think it's just one of those things that just shouldn't be together.
Unless you're Panthemonium.
Yeah.
Okay, unless you're Panthemonium, I'll give you that one. Okay, you had to pull that one out, didn't you? But I think Nightfall was a really strong track for that album. So those are my final thoughts. I think we should have, if we had time, we should have included Greed and Nightfall to sort of round the perspective of Tuonela, because I think Divinity is sort of one-sided.
Well, maybe the unedited version that you put on your site
possibly
could possibly it could be an extra, a bonus track.
I'll add this to the final thing. If you like Divinity and you think it sounds cool, go check out the album. Either go to iTunes, sample Nightfall, sample Greed, maybe even sample Summer's
End is a really
the closing
nice
track on there. And if you like it, go buy the record. this is my final comment.
Sure. And if you have any personal comments for us, please give us an email at requiemmetalpodcast. Podcast at gmail.com. Sorry.
Repeat that again, please.
Requiempodcast at gmail.com.
And you can find unedited episodes or unedited enhanced episodes with track breaks and pictures at requiempodcast.com.
And, we want to thank you, Chris. We're hoping to maybe get another podcast in later today with you, at least maybe a couple more. But we really appreciate finally having you here to rein us in our knowledge a little bit. It's nice to have sort of an encyclopedic kind of person who was part of that scene, because Mark was part of it, but Mark has memory lapses at times. So
no problem.
No problem.
So, thank you, guys. I appreciate you driving all the way to Philadelphia to do this one podcast.
That's yeah, well, we got to leave in an hour, so we got
Skype.
We got
to do it the real way.
A 10-hour drive ahead of us. So
face to face.
But for Requiem Metal Podcast, I'm Jason Hundy.
I'm Mark Rudolph.
I'm Chris Dick.
My darling, why there's fire on my feelings.